teach that the Lord's Supper is not for the church at large to enjoy together, that they would say, split off and have it in your houses. And there's a certain line of reasoning that they use, which I don't believe is correct. And one of the reasonings that they have is a misinterpretation, I believe, of verse 20, when it says here, when you come together therefore into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. So they'll take that verse and they'll say, see, when we come together as a church into one place, the purpose is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That's why to break bread and drink of the cup as a church is not right. And people that do it on a Sunday, it's not the right thing to do. What you should be doing is, families should be inviting families over and having meals within the houses. And then that's when you break bread together, because you don't want to come together to condemnation, eating the Lord's Supper when you're not meant to. But see, in the context of what's said around that, it talks about the divisions that are among them, the heresies. Then it says, when ye come together therefore into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Now, there's a second way that you can read that. You can say that when the Corinthians were coming together, they weren't eating the Lord's Supper because they weren't waiting for one another. They were separating from each other. So this is not the Lord's Supper, because the Lord's Supper is something that you actually eat together. So whilst they can say they're coming together to eat the Lord's Supper, Paul is admonishing them saying, no, when you come together, you're not eating the Lord's Supper, right? This is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Why? Verse 21, because in eating, everyone taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. So you can see there that he's saying, you're not eating the Lord's Supper because you're not waiting for one another and there are divisions. Now, I think this is supported by the fact, because if you see from verse 21 onwards, that's now talking about the ordinance, from verse 23 onwards, it's talking about the ordinance of the breaking of bread and the cup, and going back to what Jesus did. Now, if you skip over that whole passage there, which is just talking about that ordinance and how we are to examine ourselves, he concludes at verse 33 and verse 34 saying, wherefore? So because of all these things I've talked about, he says, wherefore, my brethren, when ye come together to eat, tarry one for another. So what was the issue he brought up in verse 20 and 21? They weren't waiting for one another. So he concludes at the end saying, therefore, when ye come together, wait for each other, because that was the problem. That's why you weren't eating the Lord's Supper together, because you weren't together. And in verse 33, he clarifies that saying, when ye come together to eat, wait for one another, tarry one for another. Now, I had somebody tell me that this coming together, because, when they believe that the Lord's Supper is not for the whole church and it's just for individual little groups, they would have to believe that this coming together in verse 33 is referring to a different coming together that's talked about in the verses preceding. Because you can see the same words are used further up. Verse 18. First of all, when ye come together in the church. Right? So there's that coming together. And then it says here in verse 20, when ye come together therefore into one place. Now we go to verse 33, again it says, when ye come together. Now somebody that believes that you can only have the Lord's Supper in individual houses, they say that, well, this is not talking about the coming together into one place or coming together in the church, right? This is just a coming together. So you would somehow have to reason in your mind that even though the passage is preceding, which this is referring to, he's saying when you come together in the church, when you come together into one place, you're not eating the Lord's Supper because you're not waiting for one another. Then he says here in verse 33, wherefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Now, to me, I would reasonably assume that this is talking about the same coming together, because there's one coming together previously that they're not waiting for each other, and he's saying now come together and wait for one another. But somebody that believes that the Lord's Supper should be done separately in individual houses, they're saying that the first coming together, you're not waiting for each other and you're not eating the Lord's Supper. But when you come together in the individual houses, wait for one another. Now, that could make sense unless you include verse 34. Because verse 34 says, and if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that ye come not together unto condemnation, and the rest will I set in order. So why then, if it's coming together is meeting in your homes, that he says, well, if you're hungry, eat at home. But aren't you already at home? And if you're going to have like a non-public gathering, like if I'm just going to invite like one or two families over, why would I invite them over for dinner and then not wait for them to eat? Like, does that make sense? Like I invite Michael over, I invite Ozzy over with his family, and then I invite them over and then I'm hungry, so that I don't wait for them. I'm just eating without them. But then it says, but if I'm hungry, let them eat at home. So I'm already home though. So to me, it just doesn't make sense unless it's referring to the other people. But I think it just requires a bit of twisting and unreasonableness to fit that interpretation into this passage, rather than accepting that verse 20 is saying, no, the Corinthians coming together were not waiting, they were dividing, and therefore they were not eating the Lord's Supper, and this is why Paul is rebuking them. And then he concludes saying, hey, when you come together, wait for each other so that you actually are eating the Lord's Supper together. So